This is Paul. Since Jordan Peterson is doing his book tour, I've been looking at John Vervaeke's videos on awakening from the meaning crisis, and he's got 4 of them posted, and they are similar to some of the course content that he had on Buddhism and cognitive science that has been posted for a while, but these have much better sound, which is really an improvement. And he just recently did a conversation with Benjamin Boyce, which I thought was an excellent conversation. Someone had said, "Oh, you should talk to him," and I responded. That was in the comment section of the last video I did on this, and I commented that I would like to talk to him at some point, but I'd like to learn more of his stuff first, because I think the better grounded I am in his stuff, the better conversation we're going to have, and we won't have to spend quite so much time agreeing on terms and figuring out what we're all talking about when we're using what language. But so that's part of the reason I'm working through his stuff first. And one of the cool takeaways from the Benjamin Boyce conversation with Vervaeke was this oppositional processing versus adversarial processing. And I'll have worldview differences from John, and he'll have worldview differences from me, but the goal is that actually with people with different worldviews talking with each other, that we can learn from each other, and we can probably discover other things from each other because we're coming at the world from a different perspective. And that's oppositional processing versus adversarial processing. And of course, there's a very famous passage in the Bible, in the Proverbs, that talks about iron versus iron sharpening iron. Now, I want to, through this conversation, look at 3 main meta worldviews. And as I talk to people, I will often try to discern which of these large meta worldviews they are speaking from. And these meta worldviews have within them certain commitments to some basic foundational presuppositions and perspectives about the world. Now, there are many of these, and you can get successively higher resolution on many of these, and then you'll find different religions coalescing around these ideas and these points. But just for the sake of clarity and simplicity, I reduce them down to 3 main ones that are really in play in a lot of the conversations that we're doing today. The first one is materialist or secular materialism. Matter is foundational, consciousness and agency is derivative. And so if Sam Harris would be a good example of one of these individuals, that we exhibit agency in this world. We move things because matter and energy is arranged in such a way that we can move things in the world. In Jordan Peterson language, this is the world as construed as a space of objects. Okay, and again, now, not all of this is consistent of every secular materialist, but I'm talking in generalizations about some of these presuppositions. So the main presupposition is that matter is foundational, consciousness and agency are derivative based on the arrangement of matter, and I'm going to say matter and energy. So that is the first main meta worldview. The second is associated with the Hindu family of religions, and I'm going to call it chaotic lapsarian. That sounds kind of weird. The worldview story usually begins with primordial oneness, and then there's God play, and things fall into chaos. And the basic storyline patterns may be cyclical, and things, it may be a palingenesia type cycle. It might be, well, and basically, if you listen to some strains of Hinduism, everything was one in the beginning, and then we fell into differentiation, and that's what we live in now. And there's chaos in this differentiation, and there's order in this differentiation. But we left oneness and we went into differentiation, and in that differentiation there is suffering. But primarily this world is illusory. And as we get into John Vervaeke, and if you've already listened to 1 through 4 that he's released, he's already introduced the axial age. So this this perspective is very much an axial age perspective, all right? And in terms of the kind of the flat worldview or the continuous cosmos, which John talks about as being a very early stage, and then the axial revolution, and now kind of a neo-continuous cosmos, which the video I'll play towards the end of this video, which John talks about as being partly responsible for our current meaning crisis. So the number 2 and number 3 are very much axial age meta worldviews. And so again, there's a primordial oneness. It falls into chaos. And well, why did it fall into chaos? And then sometimes the answer you'll hear given by some groups is God play. This is God being playful. So, you know, the primordial oneness goes into chaos, and then the goal, as in Russian Doll on Netflix, and as in in Hinduism, and John actually talks about this, is escape from the cycle, getting back to the primordial oneness. Now, God in this worldview tends to be fundamentally pantheistic. Part of what's difficult about using the word God in our context is that, what do you mean by God? And in these worldviews, God means, it's something similar to what you might find, let's say, in Star Wars. The Force is kind of like God. It permeates everything, and you know, you could go higher resolution and pull that apart a little bit more. But for sake of illustration, that's sort of what we're talking about. God is impersonal or transpersonal, as Houston Smith says in his common textbook in world religion classes. You can easily find it on Amazon, The World Religions by Houston Smith. The third is what I'll call Abrahamic theism. So again, the first is secular materialism. The second is chaotic lapsarianism associated with Hindu. And the third is Abrahamic theism. This is usually associated with the three main Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. You have agentful consciousness is foundational. That's God is the source of all being. Agentful consciousness is foundational and is formative to the shape and pattern of matter that we experience. And if you go back and watch some of John's early videos, I treated this in one of my earlier videos in Buddhism and cognitive science, you get into Aristotle and his 4 causes, and you have the formal cause. And so God is not only the telos, the final cause, he's the instrumental cause of creation in Genesis 1. He's also the formal cause. He creates the forms that we see around us. In other words, matter is organized and shaped by agency. That might in itself be a definition of agency, or one definition of agency, or one aspect of agency, that which forms matter gives it form. But agency consciousness is foundational. God, before the tohu wavohu, before there was heaven and earth, there was God. And now my dog is going to visit us. He was nicely sleeping before. Yeah, are you going to visit me? Yeah. I've said before, every video is made better by a dog, but I'm not going to pick you up because I don't want to rile you up anymore. Okay, you'll get away with some petting. So, agentful consciousness is foundational and is formative to the shape and pattern of matter that we experience. This forum where human beings act is conscious agent rich. In other words, obviously there's other human beings around, but God is the big conscious agent in the theater, but there are others. God is doing his thing, and there are other agents beyond human beings. I have that a little further. I kind of want to pull it in now. This is the 3-tiered cosmos, where in say a theism like Christianity, between now missiologists have put this together. Missiologists that came out of the Christian West and went to Africa and Asia and Latin America and dealt with many animistic spaces, noted that there are spirits and gods and angels and demons and ancestors. Now, these are present in the Bible. They don't necessarily get a whole lot of focus, especially angels and demons. different cultures have different middle tier spirits. In the West, often this middle tier is collapsed and done away with, and then down in the bottom you have the secular realm of people and matter and these things. So this is basically a three-tiered cosmos. Now, all of these worldview commitments, and that's what we are when we start playing in them, when we start becoming aware of them, we in a sense have to start sort of choosing sides between them. And there's interchange between your worldview and the reason, and a reason is sort of I'm using Ian McGilchrist's idea of reason as kind of a consistency checker, okay? There's interchange between your worldview and reason, and it'll shape your language and belief. And actually a lot of Vervaeke stuff in here gets into those kinds of issues. And there's some really good stuff about belief and language in video 4 of his series. But what I'm saying here is that your worldview commitments will have consequences. And they'll have consequences for your actions. They'll have consequences for your language. They'll have consequences for your tribal groups. They'll have consequences for a lot in your life. Now, your worldview commitments, you might not be very aware of your worldview commitments. It might take some time for you to realize if I would sit down and ask you a series of questions, that might be an interesting idea for a video, ask you a series of questions, I could probably get a sense of your worldview commitments. One of those questions would involve miracles. Do you believe in miracles? Do you believe in ghosts? Do you believe, one would be to, kind of a Star Wars Jedi religion would differentiate pantheism from, let's say, classical theism of Christianity. So people tend to have their worldviews, and they're usually just kind of walk around with them, mostly as assumptions, axiomatic assumptions that are guiding what they believe. And if pushed for a moment or they get a new experience, they have to kind of sit down and they'll have a worldview check. But all of this language that I'm using, worldview, this is all fairly contemporary, and it's we'll use a Don Hoffman idea. It's an interface into the internal mind of your working. But the worldview language has been around for a while. Francis Schaeffer talked a lot about it. Reformed Christianity, Calvin College talked a lot about worldview back into the, when I was there, back into the 70s and 60s. So it's been around a while. But most people are walking around. Everybody has a worldview. They might not be terribly aware of their worldview, but the worldview they have, at one level or another, they're committed to, and it will have consequences in terms of their language, and it will also have consequences in terms of how they assimilate new information. For example, when C.S. Lewis begins his book Miracles, he starts with an example that the only person that he knew that ever saw a ghost didn't believe in ghosts. Well, how does that happen? Well, the point that he makes at the beginning of Miracles, he doesn't necessarily use the language of worldview, I don't believe. But the point that he makes in the book is that these worldview commitments guide our process of assimilating new experiences, and we will either turn onto new experiences or suppress interpretations or even experiences based on the worldview commitments that we have. Now, people who are self-consciously religious and committed to certain religious traditions will in fact patrol the borders of their worldview with more scrupularity, because they will say, well, doing these things will hurt my commitments and are inconsistent with my commitments, but some of these other things are much more in line with my commitments. So worldviews matter, and we're going to get into this quite a bit more. Now, one of the really cool pieces of language that I picked up from John Vervaeke has been this phrase psychotechnology. And as with picking up many things, you have to hear it a few times and listen to them and use it a few times until you really kind of get a grasp on this new language. And the more I think about it and use it and process the meaning of this term as he works his way through the videos, the more it's clear to me how this term is very much embedded in one of these worldviews, which is sort of secular materialism and a scientific worldview. Now, Just on Twitter, I saw that someone was arguing that you shouldn't call a group of female vocalists, the work of a group of female vocalists, seminal, because seminal actually comes from the word semen, which comes from seed, and so this somehow is offensive. And in fact, the person said you shouldn't use the word seminal at all anymore because it's associated with semen, which tends to be associated more with men. So somehow, this kind of language pettiness I'm used to bumping into amongst religious people, and now to find it out in the secular world, it's like, boy, you're going to have some problems, because that level of purity and sacredness around things which should be considered more common, that leads communities into trouble and often needless and petty conflict. But and so when I'm deconstructing a term like psychotechnology, and I point out its embeddedness in one of the three meta worldviews, that isn't to say I'm not going to use the language. I'm just going to remember some of its embedding when I do use the language, because some of that embedding will continue to impact what I call my consciousness committee that's inside my head. And this is part of the ways that we influence each other subtly. And so, okay, I understand that the word seminal might trigger you if you've developed a really strong allergy to anything that has to do with masculinity. It might trigger someone who's developed a really strong reactive constitution. Those are all metaphor word pictures to sexual references. I mean, the problem is that the more you study words, the more you realize that these things have deep roots, and in fact, as we use these roots, their embeddedness in certain places also has consequences and ramifications in terms of the actual worldviews that we're running around with, that we are acting out of. And those of you who have been watching my videos through the Peterson stuff will hear living as if and a bunch of Peterson pragmatism in that. Not to necessarily embrace the whole thing, but just to give pragmatism its due with respect to the idea that you do live out your axioms and you do live out your worldviews. And when you use language in certain ways, the embeddedness of that language will in fact impact and sink into your consciousness committee and affect you, which is basically the point of the seminal tweet. But at the same time, you also have to recognize that, well, the person who lives in a world, Jonathan Haidt brings this up in the Joe Rogan podcast, the person that lives in this world avoiding anything like peanuts will develop a peanut allergy. And so, in fact, give pregnant women peanut butter and serve peanut butter to children, and they won't develop a peanut allergy. Keep them away from peanuts, and they probably will. A tiny percentage of people will develop a peanut allergy anyway. There are always outliers, but this kind of hygiene and purity awareness is important to keep in mind. These dynamics are important to keep in mind in terms of language. So, probably a far too long disclaimer. Psychotechnology is a term that is embedded in a worldview, and it's embedded really in a secular materialist worldview. Now, if you've been watching my other videos, I argue that, in fact, secular materialism is itself embedded within Christianity, but we won't go there in this video. That's a much longer conversation. And this idea of a psychotechnology, because technology is something we wield to achieve a goal. It's to hit a mark rather than miss it. And it's an instrumental expression of the will. And as opposed to a physical technology, let's call it perhaps a physiotechnology, which might be a lever or a rock or a car, a psychotechnology are ways of thinking, pathways that we develop. Exaptation is a word that he uses in his videos a lot. Pathways that we develop to achieve certain other goods. And we're going to talk about the kinds of goods that in the Axial Age psychotechnology allowed us to do. And in fact, psychotechnology allows us to express our agency in the physical world in many other ways as well. The willful agent is assumed by this word and how it's embedded, and it's not dispelled or displaced. This is modernity. In other words, it's willful agents that employ psychotechnology. They might be doing it consciously, they might be doing it unconsciously, simply out of habit, or they've simply inherited it from their parents and learned how to do it. In the Vervaeke Benjamin Boyce video, there was a lovely conversation about language, which I very much profited from. And talking about language and story, talking about part of the reason we have so few very, very early memories is that we hadn't yet developed the psychotechnology of storytelling to embed those memories in our identity and carry them along. Those of you who've watched my past videos know that if you ask me what a human being is, I will tell you that a human being is a story. We're a very special kind of story. We are an embodied story, but this is part of my resistance to, let's say, the new atheists or a secular materialist meta-narrative, which would say that the story fundamentally comes about because of the matter. And I would say, yes, sort of, but I would say that it's actually embedded and simultaneous to the matter, and really the crux of the crux of the division between the secular materialists and both the chaotic lapsarian and the classical theists is going to be which comes first, matter or story. So I'm not as familiar with the religious traditions of the chaotic lapsarian, the Hinduistic traditions, but in the Christian tradition, the conscious agent comes first. I would imagine that in the chaotic lapsarian traditions, also the conscious agent comes first, because the great oneness, the great sea of oneness, is itself conscious. It's sort of a meta-consciousness. It's not necessarily, or a trans-consciousness. It's not necessarily the kind of consciousness that you and I are experiencing now. In Christianity, the consciousness of the God is a little bit more like what you and I are experiencing now, just on a far greater level. And you'll listen to Jonathan Peugeot, you'll hear Jonathan handles this, I think, quite well. I've learned a lot from Jonathan on that score. Now, one of the many stillborn videos that happen in my head. I might make a blog post about this. I might still do a video on this. Sam Harris was on Joe Rogan, and Sam always triggers me a little bit, and because he says some things and I get a little annoyed, and then I want to make a video. But one of the things that Sam Harris often does is he has what I call a conveniently forgotten self-agency. And I find this both in Sam Harris and Brett Weinstein, that they talk about the formation of consciousness and the evolution of consciousness and the evolution of our stories in terms of both the genetics and the genetic prehistory and all of the experiences that we have, and all of this goes to create a human being. And I believe that is true. The difference between me and them is that I believe that there are other willful, active, conscious agents in our forum for action that are in fact impinging on us and shaping and molding and guiding. And I've often used the illustration of Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings, that there's an authorial, there's an authorship that's happening by the main conscious agent, who is God, that is somehow intertwining with all of these experiences that we have. So on one hand, as someone who believes in, for example, organic inspiration, which was a term that, I don't know how broadly beyond the Dutch, but if you look at, say, the theology of a Dutch theologian like Herman Bavinck, all of this stuff gets poured into us, okay? So it's a very rich worldview, and this is where, probably won't go into it too far, in this video, but in other videos, neo-sacramentalism comes in. But what I find so often with Sam Harris is that he forgets the Christian assumptions of his agency as he's promoting the materialist worldview. So according to Sam Harris, the willful agent is explained away by his anthropology. And this is where Sam Harris, actually, he had a fairly long section in the Joe Rogan podcast about 2/3 of the way through, where Sam Harris kind of ran through. I thought about playing it here, but I don't know if I want to take the time on what will already be a long video. Sam runs through his ideas along these lines about, well, we have an experience of free will, we have an experience of agency, but what we're actually doing is we're just playing out the sum total of our biological and experiential and life situations as we go through. And so fundamentally, the experience of agency is illusory, and the experience of free will, of choice, is illusory. And in fact, the experience of knowledge is in some ways illusory too. And this is where we have these three meta worldviews. They do tend to flow in and out of each other in some ways. And so Sam Harris's self-forgetfulness is in a funny way an axial position once you get into and understand Vervaeke's talk about this, the axial world. And I find Brett Weinstein doing this all the time when he talks about we are these evolutionary programmed creatures, but then we can somehow transcend the evolutionary programmed creature, and you just have to pause and say, well, how does one transcend this given your worldview? And where exactly in your worldview is there agency or choice? Is there actually room for the subjective, or is it just basically physics and those things that are riding on physics, like psychology and history, those things just expressing themselves? Now, I've talked about this quite a bit in my past videos on C.S. Lewis's book Miracles, because he points out the real problems of agency and knowing from this perspective. That you have difficulty knowing truth if all you have is mere derivative experience of knowing. And you can illustrate that quite nicely because there have been many truths that you've thrown to the side along the way, when in the moment they sure seem true to you. Later, upon greater consideration, you've jettisoned it and embraced other truths. Now, this is, most of us will agree, actually a healthy thing. But if all of our knowledge is simply that which is constructed by the world around us, and C.S. Lewis, this is the whole show, well, there are issues in terms of that, especially with respect to morality, and therefore also with respect to agency. So you have a similar problem with agency and will, free will, or real agency as I prefer to call it, because you only feel like you have agency. You're just the sum of all your past experiences. And I've probably read this before, but I'll read it again. Part of his book Miracles that I think illustrates it nicely. All the ideas of good and evil are hallucinations, shadows cast on the outer world by the impulses which we have been conditioned to feel. Indeed, many naturalists are delighted to saying this, and you will catch Sam Harris saying this, and then he will turn around and say something else a few sentences later. But then they must stick to it. And fortunately, though inconsistently, most real naturalists do not. The moment after they have admitted that good and evil are illusions, you will find them exhorting us to work for posterity, to educate, to revolutionize, to liquidate, to live and die for the good of the human race. A naturalist like Mr. H.G. Wells spent a long life doing so with passionate eloquence and zeal. But surely this is very odd. Just as all the books about spiral nebulae, atoms, and cavemen would really have led you to suppose that the naturalist claimed to be able to know something, so all the books in which naturalists tell us that what we ought to do would really make you believe that they would think that some ideas of good, their own for example, to be somehow preferable to others. For they write with indignation, like men proclaiming what is good in itself, and denouncing what is evil in itself, and not at all like men recording that they personally like mild beer, but some men prefer bitter. And this again gets into C.S. Lewis's example that if you really apply, Lewis would say, rationality, consistency with their worldview, the whole show breaks down. And what Lewis actually does in Miracles is critique both secular materialism or naturalism, as he calls it here, and eventually pantheism. Yet if the aughts of Mr. Wells and, say, Franco, that's the general who was ruling Spain at the time that caused who rose to power in the Spanish Civil War, yet if the aughts of Mr. Wells and, let's say, Franco are both equally the impulses which nature, capital N, has conditioned each to have, and both tell us nothing about any objective right or wrong, whence is all the fervor? Do they remember, while they are writing thus, that when they tell us we ought to make a better world, words such as ought and better must, on their own showing, refer to an irrationally conditioned impulse which cannot be true or false any more than a yawn or a vomit? My idea is that sometimes they forget. So basically I get my idea from Lewis. That is their glory. Holding a philosophy which excludes humanity, they yet remain human. At the sight of injustice, they throw all their naturalism to the wind and speak like men and like men of genius. And again, if you watch the first part of Sam Harris's talk with Joe Rogan and compare it to the second part where he's going on about our lack of agency, you have to wonder, well, did you forget what you were doing in the first part of this conversation? Because you sure are exhorting us as if we had agency to do what you think is right, as if this is something you could know, and not simply the working out of physics from the Big Bang onward. They know far better than they think they know, but at other times, I suspect, they are trusting in a supposed way of escape from their difficulties. Now, C.S. Lewis thought that the best apologist he had read was G.K. Chesterton, a writer from a generation before him, who himself, if you've never read any Chesterton, was a truly hilarious and brilliant man. He wrote all kinds of different books. One of his books about Christianity was called The Everlasting Man, and he begins the book, introduction. I started rereading the book because I'm thinking about all these things like I'm always doing. I'm always reading too many books at once. So I started rereading The Everlasting Man, and the introduction is just this delightful treatment of the strange and the new and the familiar. And he tells the story of a boy who goes far away from his farm that he grew up in and spent his whole life in, only to realize that his farm was actually resting upon a giant. Now, when he was on the farm, he just saw this landscape of hills. He didn't realize it was a giant until he got far enough away from the farm to be able to see the giant. And this is exactly G.K. Chesterton's point about so many of the atheist apologists that were present in G.K. Chesterton's day, because the games that Sam Harris is playing have been played throughout the 20th century, and one would argue actually reached their height more in G.K. Chesterton's time than today. And the point that Chesterton makes is that in many ways you can only really differentiate these worldviews the more that you travel. And you only see your own worldview to the degree that you get away from it and actually listen to people of other worldviews and really work hard to try to understand them. And that's actually the way you can see your own. Now, G.K. Chesterton, at that point, as has been the case for many generations, was concerned about the falling away of the church and saw a lot of people who were only a half generation outside of the church basically dismissing it in a rather shallow and facile way. And so that's part of what he was complaining about in the introduction. For those in whom a mere reaction has thus been of subsession, I seriously recommend the imaginative effort to conceive the 12 apostles as Chinamen. Now he's working in a different day. But his point here is that if if you weren't so familiar with Christianity, it would look very different to you. And actually, we see this all the time in Christian atheist conversations. In other words, I recommend these critics to try to do as much justice to Christian saints as if they were pagan sages. By this we come to the final and vital point. I shall try to show in these pages that when we do make this imaginative effort to see the whole thing from outside, we find that it really looks like what is traditionally said about it on the inside. It is exactly when the boy gets far enough to see the giant that he sees that he really is a giant. It is exactly when we do at last see the Christian church far from those clear and level eastern skies that we see that is really the church of Christ. To put it shortly, the moment we are really impartial about it, we know why people are partial to it. And this is just an example of Chesterton's really clever turn of phrase. But the second proposition requires a more serious discussion, and I shall set myself to discuss it. And then Chesterton goes on to work on it. So again, people are always asking me for book recommendations. G.K. Chesterton, he's a little dated, but if you can make it through the language of his time, he's a whole lot of fun and very bright. So let's get to know Vervaeke a little bit. And I think Benjamin Boyce's conversation, it's over an hour, is a really good introduction to Vervaeke and where he's coming from. Now in video 1, he states that he's a scientist, and so I'm always trying to figure out, okay, what's the worldview of the person I'm listening to? Not to necessarily discriminate against them, but really to better understand them, so I can better understand their use of language. Now, understanding is always limited, and I'll get things wrong, and so there's always room for greater resolution. But he states that he is a scientist, which is sometimes a code for a materialist. And again, none of us are consistent. And one of the things, again, I'm really appreciating from listening to this series is bringing up this idea of bullshitting. And he gets into that increasingly as you go through. And I think it was video 4 that he really sort of lays it out and walks through it. And it's a really powerful term. So again, some of you who are Christians and see that I make these videos about non-Christians, well, most of you have probably left the channel, because if you thought, well, I'm not going to learn anything from people who aren't Christians, well, then you're probably not going to like what I'm doing, because I learn a tremendous amount from people who are non-Christians. And I would hope that non-Christians would learn something from me, and I hope to be able to present ideas in ways that non-Christians can learn something from me. I'm part of the segment of Christianity that believes all truth is God's truth. Yet I also come from a tradition that also played a lot with noticing what in our tradition we called the antithesis. So there are all these ways of thinking, and I think it's helpful to keep all of these ways of thinking in mind as we go. So part of the reason I'm excited every Friday when a new video comes out is because, oh good, here's a new video. And I'll learn more from him, and I'm enjoying this. It's not uncommon, and this is one of the things that I noticed from Vervaeke, that Buddhism is a certain kind of Western secular Buddhism is very popular now, and I live in Sacramento, California, so many of my friends and neighbors are very much into this kind of thing. And if people hear, oh, that's Christian, well, it's kind of a negative connotation to it. But they hear, oh, it's Buddhist and meditation. All these things right now have a very popular vibe in our culture, and everybody wants to learn about meditation. As a pastor, I hear that and kind of think, yeah, everybody wants to learn about meditation and nobody wants to do it because doing it is hard. It's not unlike prayer. Everybody says good things about prayer, but not a lot of people spend a lot of time in it, because you know what? Spending a lot of time in prayer is hard. Just like meditation. I think meditation is a wonderful thing. You go do it. So Buddhism is very popular, but it's a particular kind of Buddhism that I tend to see as fashionable in Sacramento, California, and I would imagine in Toronto, Canada as well, because these kind of things tend to run through. Things don't spread out geographically and kind of like wallpaper. Our culture moves in different ways, and so you go to San Francisco or the Bay Area or Sacramento, and you'll find these kinds of things having resonance. Part of what I'm really enjoying about the Vervaeke project is I'm very interested in salience and resonance and figuring out what's going on in my noodle when things interest me. And that's, part of what I've been learning a lot of in my, since I found Jordan Peterson and started making videos and had all of you wonderful listeners out there that post comments and send me emails and video recommendations and book recommendations, none of which I can really keep up on. But at the same time, what I can skim from them has enriched me greatly. And so Vervaeke is one of the finds along the way here, and his idea of salience and relevance and what's that dynamic in my mind. And again, you might say, well, how does this go with your worldview? We're going to have to talk about that, because if you might have noticed about my worldview, just like my idea about biblical inspiration is organic, my worldview has all these three tiers. And so the secular realm is real, and science is real. And for me, too, the middle realm is real. I do believe in spirits. And the top realm is real. I do believe in God. In my worldview, the world is full of agents and beyond just humans and perhaps animals in a limited extent. And I'm not necessarily talking about aliens, but I'm not excluding them. And I just did a conversation with Josh that I'll publish. I'll probably publish this video today because I like to kind of pace out my conversation videos from these long rambling videos that I do that y'all seem to like for some reason. They're fun for me to make, so if you're listening to them and you get ideas and you send me stuff, that's fun for me too. So it's just been a wonderful thing. But so this idea of salience and relevance and the mechanisms of that in cognitive science, that really has my interest. It's very salient to me now, so I'm very much enjoying Vervaeke. So let's listen to a little bit of video 4 where he gives us a little worldview tell. And I'm going to do that with a couple of other people too, and I'll do a little bit of comment in it. So again, my usual disclaimer, if you want to hear the video uninterrupted, and I would recommend that you not only watch video 4, but you watch videos 1 through 4. I think they're all really good for those of you who, like me, are big, who like long form YouTube. They're all about an hour long, but they're really good stuff. And I know some of you have been, since Peterson's doing his book tour and he doesn't produce that many videos and he's not doing classes anymore. So here's a good class to take. But I am going to interrupt it, and if you don't like me interrupting, then watch the whole thing. So here it is. Here we go.
So getting into the figure of Socrates is kind of interesting.
So he's going to talk about Socrates, and one of the things I really like about this course is that he goes through a lot of history. And some of you might remember that I was a history major in college, love history. And I also love philosophy, so history of philosophy, well, that's just double fun. So he's going to talk a little about Socrates. And just before this, he had a little disclaimer. The historical Socrates is sort of like the historical Jesus. We only know Socrates through Plato, and so there's always a lot of debate. What was Socrates and what was Plato, just kind of having him do stuff. But he's going to talk about the historical Socrates here, and he just gave some disclaimers, and I'm satisfied with those disclaimers. I'm not going to debate that aspect of it.
A good way to start is to see how provocative a person he was, is to do his biography. So, as many of you probably know, ancient Greece was a world in which people believed they could speak to the god through oracles.
Okay, right there. So this is both history, but also the way the kinds of I've played before a piece of a video from Dallas Willard, Veritas Forum, And Dallas Willard, in that video, Dallas Willard spent a lot of time talking about worldview. One of the things he noted, which was dead on right, is that most of our worldview communication and, in fact, proselytizing happens implicitly and through status. And so it's the little tells that give away what disclaimers are you going to have to give. And so right there he gave away a disclaimer about, well, they believed in gods, and there's some chronological snobbery there perhaps. I'm not saying of him, but in the zeitgeist, because right now the secular materialism will be the prevailing principality in a secular university. Now you go over to a church, and the prevailing principality might in fact be classical theism. You go over to, let's say, maybe a yoga studio or a meditation center, and the prevailing principality might be this chaotic Laxarian Hindu sort of thing. So there's different prevailing principalities, and we as human beings we pay great attention to status and subtle tells. And so what we usually do is sort of mask. You go into the university, and the Christians and the theists and some people who are more spiritual and believe that they're spiritual beings having a physical experience rather than physical beings having a spiritual experience. When you go into, in a sense, enemy territory, you sort of mask and withhold some of your beliefs, and you play a different game. And we all get used to playing different worldview games in different worldview settings. And it's often the little disclaimers that we make, and we cover some of our tells. So he's going back into ancient Greece, and ancient Greece were polytheists. And I'm going to take a drink, so I'm going to pause the video here. So as he tells the story, you'll hear some of the little tells, especially, and this is another dynamic, you most often recognize the tells of the competing worldviews. In other words, we're blind to our own worldviews, and we're very sensitive to the other worldviews because there's dissonance in there. And this is why, again, if you listen to Jonathan Haidt, diversity is really helpful, because you're blind to your own tells. And so if, like me, I'm a Christian pastor and I wish to communicate with people who aren't Christian, it's important that I, as much as possible, I'll never be fully aware of them, as much as possible be aware of the ways in which certain habits of language, of my language by virtue of my embeddedness in my worldview, irritate secular materialists or spiritual but not religious, or spiritual but having a physical experience. So I'm very sensitive to tells of other worldviews, and I listen for them, but I also try not to get too reactive, because at some point you basically have to say that's their worldview. And again, part of my religious package is to say that's their worldview. I may disagree with them, but they are an image bearer of God, and my standing orders from my master is to love my neighbor as myself, all the way up to and including my enemies. So even if I'm very reactive with respect to these worldview tribes, by virtue of my religion, my standing orders are to love my worldview opponents and don't make them your adversaries. Okay? So let's keep going.
The oracles were human or otherwise natural phenomena that represented how the gods were speaking to humanity. The oracles were a world. Many of you probably know ancient Greece was a world in which people believed they could speak to the god through oracles. The oracles were human or otherwise.
Believed to the gods. They were human. Again, the frame is a secular university, and so the principality and power over that secular university is, now using principality and power, I'm appropriating New Testament language. There's a tell. The zeitgeist, there's a little less embedded language.
Natural phenomena that represented how the gods were speaking to humanity. Well, one of the most important oracles is at Delphi. And I've been to Delphi. If you get a chance at some point in your life, go to Delphi. It will really put the zap on your brain, because the way the landscape is organized really does have a transformative impact on sort of your consciousness and your sense of self and your sense of place in the world. So,
and now what's interesting is even that little phrase locates him in terms of not highly rationalistic. He's much more, John Vervaeke's kind of on the cutting edge of materialism, and we're going to get into this, of materialism, who are increasingly aware of ways to appropriate axial age psychotechnology in order to address the meaning crisis. In fact, that's what this whole course is about. Well, actually, I'll play a video clip about that a little bit later. But again, all of this, if you become sensitive to all of this language, it's really helpful to kind of understand where people are. Now, the difficulty is that if you, in fact, label someone like I just did, John, he might want to recalibrate that a little bit, which is absolutely fair, because I don't really know the man. I've never shaken hands with him. We've never sat down for a meal. And actually, when human beings do that, there's all kinds of things that happen between us, much of which we're not even conscious of. And so, you do the kind of thing that I'm doing here with a little bit of fear, because you don't want to, annoy people too much, because what I'm doing here is in some ways could be very annoying to someone, but hopefully understood that this is what we do in the spirit of understanding each other and growing in knowledge and wisdom, and again, even across worldview camps. And most of us who live in pluralistic contexts are used to dealing with pluralism in worldviews and religion, and we've developed commonality and common spaces and common languages in order to try to bridge these gulfs.
The situation, the site of Delphi is itself very transformative. What would happen is a woman, Pythia, would sit in a cave or something similar to it. Again, the cave, always the caves, like the association with shamanism. Remember?
And Peterson and Peugeot would, do wonderful work on that. Why a cave? What does the cave represent? What archetype is the cave connecting us to? So on and so forth.
That shamanism is associated with cave art, ritual practices taking place in caves, like in Pythagoras. So she's in a cave. She's sitting on a tripod. There might be some intoxicating gases in there. She's eating perhaps eucalyptus leaves. She's probably going into some kind of psychedelic trance state. That seems plausible. And then what happens is people would, because that is a cross-cultural thing, we find that people are thought to have access to the gods by being able to enter into altered states of consciousness.
Now again, the gods, if, for example, the Greeks might have had something like a two-tiered, but they don't have, I should see if I can, let's see. The Greeks might have had a two-tiered system. They might not have had, I guess I should have labeled this, maybe I will right now. I'll just pause the video and edit it. Okay, this should make it a little bit clearer. The Greeks' polytheistic culture probably has tiers 2 and 3, okay? So that's, in a sense, a two-tiered cosmos. Modernity, Christendom, late medieval, especially modern era Christendom tended to have tiers 1 and 3. Secular materialism has tier 3. Okay? And what that means is that if you have a worldview that has multiple tiers, the worldview is more complex, but your worldview can, in fact, fit or embed or house one of the multiple tiers that you have. All right? So what he's saying is that the Greeks had tier 2 and tier 3, but they had it in a continuous cosmos phase. All right? So these three tiers are related to, but not synonymous with, the kinds of multiple worlds that we're going to talk about when we talk about the axial age. All right.
So what would happen is people would come in, they would bring their questions, they would pose questions to Pythia. She would then speak on behalf of the gods, and then after speaking on behalf of the gods, the people around her there would be males who would interpret what she had to say.
Now, to go back to our slide here, well, why speak on behalf of the gods? Well, the gods, these tiers, these gods are conscious agents that are powerful conscious agents in their continuous cosmos world, and those gods can perhaps tell them the future, those gods can perhaps give them advice, those gods can perhaps equip them and help them to achieve goals within the continuous cosmos. Now, those gods can lie, those gods can trick, those gods can tell you one thing that might be shading the truth so that you'll do a certain thing that might be towards another end. There's a lot of things that can go on here, but again, that's the worldview of ancient Greece. Now, depending on what worldview you currently have, that worldview will look different, and we're about to see that, because if you're a materialist and you hear that worldview and you don't have tier number 2, then you say, well, you have a story that basically helps you understand how reasonable and smart people could have tier number 2. Now, if, let's say, you're a Christian, an Augustinian Christian, post-Augustine city of God, you might have other ideas and interpretations of what was happening in the Oracle of Delphi. Were they demons deceiving? Augustine goes into those ideas. Were they different Christians will do different things with tier 2. And tier 2 could have, if you played Dungeons and Dragons when you were a kid, tier 2 could have, good, neutral, or evil forces and agents and conscious agents within them. So again, the worldview that you possess, and you may not have chosen your worldview, in fact, you might simply have inherited your worldview, the worldview that you possess will, in fact, situate all of this kind of information, filter it, and assimilate this. And a little bit later, we'll talk about what happens when people flip and change their worldviews, which is also something that happens, which again differentiates us from any other creature we know.
So, the thing about being an oracle is, if you want to stay in business, you don't want to give clear answers, right? So if I come to an oracle and I ask a specific question, I don't want to give a specific answer. I think there's a very good reason for that. I don't think that people actually can foresee the future in any kind of supernatural manner.
Okay, there's a worldview tell, all right? And I, as a Christian, you look at the Bible, what C.S. Lewis makes the point that, for example, if you read the ending to the Gospel of John, some people look at the ending to the Gospel of John and say, see, the Gospel of John was written after the death of Peter, because the writer of the Gospel of John could not have foretold the manner in which Peter would die. And, to Vervaeke's point, the end of the Gospel of John doesn't say, and Peter was crucified upside down because he didn't consider himself worthy to be crucified in the same manner of his Lord, so on and so forth. The end of the Gospel of John is rather vague. But then the story that you tell about, well, why is it vague, and how is it vague, and how does this work? Well, worldviews are coming into that, all right? Because we can't help but see through our worldview, and everybody has one.
So typically, if you go to an oracle and say, should I marry Cassandra, you'll get an answer something like, sometimes the spring comes early. Or, should I invest in this project, you'll get an answer like, sometimes the squirrels do not gather too many nuts. You don't know what to make of this, and it might provoke an insight in you, it might provoke a reflection in you. And whether or not the events go one way or the other, you can often retrospectively reinterpret them as having been consonant with the Delphic oracle.
And you can do this, obviously, with fortune cookies and horoscopes.
The oracle seems to be providing foresightful information, but usually, of course, it's not.
And it's a whole nother conversation whether the oracle is sincere with respect to their intuitive pattern. Now, you talked quite a bit about shamanism and psychotechnologies to alter states of consciousness in order to pick up on other patterns in the environment. And again, I mean, this whole series is great, so watch the whole thing. But it's really helpful to kind of keep tracking all of these conversations as you're keeping worldview things in mind, because that will help you just, again, try to have a informative internal dialogue while he's talking to you to figure out and to learn, well, just how complex this whole thing is. I would tend to, was the Oracle of Delphi hucksters? Now, my answer to that will reveal elements of my religious commitment, my worldview commitment, my beliefs in science, so on and so forth, perhaps being vague with respect to oracles is a psychotechnology that allows the practice to continue, and you do it in a cave, and you do it perhaps with psychedelic drugs, and so on and so forth, and maybe you're picking up, obviously, if you're a materialist, if you're the amazing Randy, and you look at religious cons or other kinds of cons, and you say, or even if you look at people who sincerely believe themselves to have psychic powers, one of the materialist explanations that you can give is going to be, well, this person is particularly intuitive, and they, even unconsciously, when they see another person, they are picking up patterns. They are comparing that person to all kinds of other patterns that they have perceived before, and their consciousness committee slips a note to their mouth, and then they say this vague thing, and that assimilates with other patterns and consciousness in that other person's life, and lo and behold, don't you know it, you have an experience of revelation. All right, we're going to get into Michael Pollan's book in a little bit, but that's not a dismissive answer, and I think it's a little better answer than, I got to be careful here because there are people with all kinds of different worldview commitments, and the way is a fortune teller always wrong? Now, I'm not talking wrong in terms of morality. I'm talking wrong in terms of accuracy with respect to predictions. And this is where this vagueness, some people who are probably sincere fortune tellers, or they might be your aunt or your neighbor or your sister or your brother or your daughter, who believe themselves fairly intuitive, might in fact be able to pick up on things from other people. They might attribute it and have language that picking up as, well, I have a gift of knowing these things. Now, Vervaeke, if you get back into his videos, he say, well, they're probably very attuned to patterns, and they pick up these patterns, and in fact, they do things to alter their consciousness in order to disrupt the patterns and in order to be able to pick up on other patterns, so they might in fact give the tribe or the family or the community or the church or the whatever group or the nation or the city a new perspective that gives them an adaptive advantage in a materialist frame over their rivals. Okay? And I think that's a perfectly legitimate story to tell. It's important to remember, though, that that story is nested in a worldview, and other worldviews are going to tell that story in different ways. The real thing that our pluralist society is really working on right now is, what do we do with these competing worldview stories? How do we manage the disagreements that are inherent in the ways that we're telling these stories?
So, what happens is a bunch of Socrates' friends, he's already famous when we sort of meet him in his biography, a bunch of Socrates' friends decide to go to the oracle and ask the oracle a question about Socrates. So they make the trip to Delphi. And I in my mind, I sort of picture this almost like half jokingly. They want to see what kind of crazy answer they're going to get from the oracle about Socrates. So they go all the way up to the oracle, and then they pose their question. And the question they pose is there anyone wiser than Socrates? And what they're looking for, or perhaps not what they're looking for, what they're expecting is some very cryptic, obscure answer. Like, the snow melts farther in the south, or some bizarre answer. And instead they get this answer: no. There's no human being wiser than Socrates. Crystal clear answer. And so you can imagine how shocked they are. So they travel back, of course, to relate this story to Socrates. And here's something telling. First of all, that's just telling in and of itself that the Delphic oracle would give such a clear answer. Now, it's a qualified answer. There's no human being wiser than Socrates, right?
Okay, because, of course, the Delphic oracle is living within a worldview in which there are other conscious agents that are in play in significant ways.
But when they go back to Socrates, Socrates' response is also profound, interesting. So if we're honest, and we found out from some sacred authority that we are very wise, most of us would be very self-congratulatory. It's like, yeah, I knew it. And how do I know that? Because one of the most persistent biases have is that people believe they're above average intelligence. And of course, most people must be wrong about that, because most people have, well, average intelligence. But if you ask anybody, is your intelligence average? They will tell you, no, I have above average intelligence. More so, of course, even for ideas such as wisdom. But Socrates isn't self-congratulatory. He doesn't say, yep, I knew it all along, there's the confirmation I so want. Now that's really telling in of itself, because to quote a friend of mine, Leo Ferraro, we are entering the age of confirmation porn, in which people are continuously seeking confirmation from their beliefs. And part of what's going on to the meaning crisis and the ever-expansion of bullshit in our society is precisely because we have technologically enhanced through social media our capacity for gratifying our bias for confirmation. We'll talk about this later, but we all carry a terrific bias called the confirmation bias, in which we seek information that confirms our beliefs, and we tend to avoid information that challenges it. And part of what is going wrong right now in our culture is that through a lot of factors that are endemic to the meaning crisis, we are accelerating and exacerbating our propensity for falling into the confirmation bias. And
again, watch the whole thing. It's a great video, because I'm really excited about this series. So they release new ones on Friday. So go ahead and get yours free on YouTube. Let's go back to this. So worldviews impact a story like this. And what's interesting too is the selection of the story, because about a year and a half ago or so, I was going through a great course on Plato's Republic. And what's interesting is that particular professor opened up introducing Socrates with the story of the political situation in Athens at the time. And again, there's no prejudice here in terms of which one is better. It's which one is fitting in terms of the course and where you're going with it. But worldviews impact this. And complexities and explanation. Materialist move is usually sort of a dismissal. I'm not saying Vervaeke's was a dismissal. I've listening to him. He's very sensitive to worldviews of other people. That's actually a part of pluralistic modernity that generally speaking, outside of certain moral issues that are increasingly on the radar, we're usually try to be pretty accepting and hospitable. That's the better word. Hospitable towards people of other worldviews. But often, again, there are there are little wars being waged under the ground, kind of like plants wage war with each other by excreting chemicals to keep other plants from germinating in their space. And as I said, via Dallas Willard, we most often communicate these worldview wars are communicated by status, and progressivism is you don't still believe that, do you? And it's often subtle sociology of knowledge pressures that bring us one way or another, that in fact move generations of people in and out of worldviews and religion. So materialist move is usually dismissal, reductive implication, and simplification. Classical theism usually leaves a lot of complexity, and that's where I have this slide, because if you are a classical theist, you may or may not have the middle realm. If you're a classical theist with the middle realm, you've got 3 tiers to operate in, and each of those tiers brings its complexity. And in fact, depending on your religious tradition, the middle realm, part of the reason the middle realm kind of fell out of favor in Western Christendom, didn't completely, because especially with the Reformation and the continued prioritization of the Bible, there are many passages in the Bible that in the Old Testament, again, Michael Heiser, a number of you will mention, Unseen, he goes into who are all these other gods in the Old Testament? I don't mean Baal and Asherah, but the Lord is the Lord above all gods. Well, he didn't say it was the only God. He said he was above all gods. And so you have to get into this question of Old Testament cosmology, and actually the multiple cosmologies that seem to be in play and in some ways in competition throughout the Old Testament. And that statement alone will produce a little bit of anxiety in certain Christians listening to this video. But if the more tiers you have, the more complexity that you have to deal with. And in a secular realm, it's fairly easy to deal with the other tiers because you can do so dismissively. And what that does is it means that all of your forces, all of your causation have to come in tier 3. Whereas if you're, let's say, a contemporary Pentecostal, then the relationship between tier 1 and tier 2 can be very interesting. And I remember with certain Christians, when bad things happen, well, that's the devil working overtime. Well, the devil is really tier 2, all right? Not tier 1, tier 2. And then you have theological questions: to what degree can the devil operate in our lives, or demons, or angels? If you read This Present Darkness, which was a very popular book in the 80s and 90s, Frank Peretti, these were novels written which were full of vivid stories of Christians praying and angels swirling around them, and spiritual warfare. Now, this is very popular and accepted language in certain segments of sub-worldviews within Christianity and other religions. And often if you find, let's say, perhaps a person from the main line, it's changing, but if you find many people will have that excluded middle, and so the devil almost completely disappears, and all you've got me and God and nothing in between. And then other worldviews, often you'll hear me say that in some ways Pentecostalism was a worldview slide. And what tended to happen in Pentecostalism was you slid that middle realm right in. And a lot of that happened even though you have the Azusa Street Mission in North America at the beginning of the 20th century, which is ironically at the height of really tier 3 only promotion amongst high status individuals. Probably a reactive, so we can get into the cognitive psychology of the rise of Pentecostalism. But then when missionaries went into Africa and Asia, initially in the modern period, it was all tier 1 and 3. Eventually, listening to nationals, seeing things that just tier 1 and tier 3 couldn't explain, or just tier 3 couldn't explain, began to bend and twist people's worldview, and they started looking at tier 1 and tier 2 differently. And I thought perhaps I should make a disclaimer. If you're listening to this in the audio version, you're not seeing the chart in front of me. Tier 1 is God. Tier 2 are the spirits, angels, demons, ancestors, etc. Tier 3 is the secular realm, people, matter, so on and so forth. Now, nesting and exclusion. I did these slides this morning. I really like to do videos right after I make the slides, but I can't always fit that into my schedule. The materialist interpretation excludes the immaterial conscious agent interpretation. I've gone over that before. This is a historical function. It was designated to do so for psychological simplification and bullshit reasons, because historically the materialist worldview made a lot of grounds because there was a lot of bullshitting in tier 1 and tier 2. And so, and when I mean bullshitting, I really mean both kinds, both the technical bullshitting that John Vervaeke will talk about in his lecture, but also the kind of normal kind that people do in the con jobs and so on and so forth. And part of the advantage of a materialist perspective is that you are demanding that things be accountable to a very material sort of verification. And that has its power, but it also has its limitations. So there's a historical function going on here. But the immaterial conscious agent allows for multiple interpretations, so you get into the question of, well, why did the oracle give a definitive answer with respect to Socrates? Now, someone could say, well, perhaps the story is a myth, and because an oracle never would really say something, or maybe Plato made up that story because he wanted to make a point about this man that he esteemed so much. Maybe it never happened. Complexity affords possibility. And so if you have a belief in tier 1 and tier 2, well, there's a lot of new options that are on the table for what the whole Oracle of Delphi is and the interpretation that is going around that. But again, your worldviews are going to impact how these stories are told by us and how we are interpreting these sets of experiences, or whether or not we are believing recorded tales or judging one story or another story with respect to history. Now, we've got some pluralist conflicted checking. And so what we're always doing is we're constantly, even though we may very much be committed to one worldview of the three, our consciousness committees are constantly checking. And it's a constant process of conflicted parallels. So you listen in a way that reinforces commitment. You're calibrating worldview details. You're processing worldview insecurities. For example, C.S. Lewis's opening start to his book Miracles talks about his friend, the only friend he knew that actually said she'd seen a ghost, doesn't believe in ghosts. That's a classic worldview conflict. Her worldview says, no, ghosts don't exist. I must have been hallucinating. There must be a medical reason to account for the experience that I had. So C.S. Lewis begins that book by saying, seeing is not always believing, because our worldview filter is an interpretive filter. And as Vervaeke noted, our biases are at play. And so we tend then to take these experiences and they get integrated into the structure that the worldview is offering. And we do so in a way that will often confirm our worldview. And we will filter things out. We'll pay no attention to some of these stories or the studies or classes. We'll avoid things that create dissonance in our worldview to find other things that confirm our worldview. And that is a common human dynamic, and it's going on with all of us. So, but another part of us mind, well, we can't unhear this whole bias thing, and we notice biases in others, and we suspect, well, maybe there's biases in me, but surely they're not as bad and inconsistent as biases in others. But we're always checking. And so, on one hand, our worldviews are mostly pretty stable. You have too many worldview transitions in your life, and you're going to bring a lot of chaos in your life. So they're not going to flip that often, but they do flip. And especially when we look at populations over time, over 100 years, over multiple generations, you will see worldview flipping and you will see religious migration. Now, the worldview layer and the religion layer are not exactly the same things. They're connected, but they're connected in a complex way. You'll find Christians in the West who are highly secular, and you'll find Christians in Africa whose tier 2 middle realm of spirits and ancestors are very vivid and experiential. And Christianity is able to cope with all of this, okay? Partly because Christianity it's very culturally diverse and been formed over a very long period of time and manages to cope with that. While people, given their particular worldviews, so classic story, the missionary coming from a very secular culture goes to Africa and denies a lot of the spirit stories and interpretations of the Africans. It's a classic story. You can find that told and retold again and again and again in many different places. So these worldviews are always at play, and our consciousness committees are always checking. And if we get too many, they're always checking, and our status indicators are always working. So this is why birds of a feather flock together, and you will be changed by the people that you spend time with. If you spend all the time in a secular university, you will likely get more and more secular, unless you have a dynamic that you're gaining status and pride by being an inside outlier, and that happens too. But it's usually a both and. So the people that you spend time with, you will inherit their beliefs and you will absorb their worldview. And your consciousness committee and your implicit knowledge receptors are going to be pulling all this in, and this is going to be getting into your mind, and this is going to be feeding into you. You can see why I don't dismiss Sam Harris's idea that we are formed human beings. The real difference between me and Sam Harris are the range of conscious agents that are in fact impacting all of what's at play in the secular realm. That's really the difference, okay? So implicit consciousness impacts, my Jordan Peterson project, is a sub-project of my longer-term fascinations with people's worldview formation. Those of you who are aware of my own personal story know that my father's side were Jews becoming Dutch, becoming American. My mother's side were Frisians having to be Dutch, becoming American. And then my father takes a church in an African American community. So I've got a whole nother set of worldviews and cultures to deal with. And so then when I go to day school, I'm going to day school in a Dutch Calvinist religious school, and I'm going to church in an African-American, Dutch, Calvinist, multicultural, pluralistic church. And of course, for me, growing up, this is all natural, and I'm living in the New York metropolitan area, so there are Italian Catholics, and there are Puerto Ricans, and there are people from all over the world who are coming in and impacting my life. And then I go to Calvin College, where I'm really in the middle of Dutch Calvinism. And that seems weird to me because it all seems so very white, and I'd never been quite deeply into it. But of course, I knew the language because I went to day school in. And then after college and seminary, I go to the Dominican Republic, and I'm immersed in a world of Dominicans speaking Spanish, but also Haitians and Dominicans. And Haitians have different worldviews, and secularism is impacting there. And from there, I go to California, and I've got whole new cultures and religions and worldviews. So I've always been and I'm a Christian pastor who was a missionary. So part of my job is to flip people's worldviews. That's part of my mission. And so, well, in order to do my mission, I should basically have an understanding of how worldviews work. Now, if I were a Pentecostal, I might, I'm not being disparaging of Pentecostals, I might basically say, well, all I really need to do is pray about it, because we'll have the Holy Spirit flip people. But then again, I've got my Calvinism, which is fairly only the Holy Spirit can flip people. But I've also got my Dutch Calvinism, which says that the secular layer and the science and the book of that is also important. So I've had a long-term project and fascination about people and their worldviews. How are they formed? Why do they flip? So that's why when I came across Jordan Peterson doing his thing and people are flipping religions, I said, ooh, that's interesting. I want to figure that out. And so now I come across John Vervaeke and cognitive science, and it's like, ooh, that's interesting. Salience, that's salient to me. And so off I am following this thing. And then I sit back and look at myself in the mirror and say, why am I interested in these things? That's a weird thing. Well, maybe it's because of my story. Maybe it's because of the Holy Spirit. Maybe it's because of God. Maybe it's because of decisions that my great-great-grandfather made back in the Netherlands when somehow he fell out of favor with the rest of the Jewish people, and then sent his son to America, and he went to America. They all dropped their Jewish names and grabbed Dutch-American names and, put us on this course. Who knows? But the question of how we got here fascinates me. And so Vervaeke's implicit learning stuff, I think, is really helpful, and I think it's really cool, and that's why I like this. But it's all embedded in this highly pluralistic, very live culture of all of these signals. And right now we're in a point in American history, Western history, where stuff is moving fast. And so for me, boy, it doesn't get more exciting than this. Now, Jordan Peterson, when he was debating Sam Harris, Jordan Peterson made a big point about stories, and Vervaeke, when he talks to Benjamin Boyce, has a wonderful section in that video about stories. And again, part of me would love to play all these videos, but this video, which is already going to be probably over 2 hours, well, then it would be 4 hours. And some of you would say, yeah, do a 4-hour video. And I would say, oh, I'd love to do a 4-hour video, but I've got other things I've got to do. So 2 hours is what you're going to get. But both Peterson and Vervaeke, I think, are very right in terms of what story is and how important it is. And if we are stories, then of course story is in a sense the natural language we swim in. And they understand how deep story is to us. It is what we really are in many respects. We are a story. We are a story that is, in Hebrew, we are a nephesh. We are one thing. And it is, we are embodied stories, and the world around us is an embodied story, is a physical story, unlike Tolkien, which is a psychotechnology of fiction, which is a story in our minds. But the reason that story in our minds moves us so much is because of the commonality between that story and what we are. So worldview transactions within a fully complex, multi-personality being like ourselves, because as Jonathan Pichot notes, I've got a consciousness committee, and Peterson notes there's all these sub-personalities going on. So we are multiple within us, and they split the brain, and so then you wind up with two different people, and one can be an atheist, and the other can believe in God, and all this crazy stuff going on. Again, Ian McGilchrist and the master and his emissary. So we're multi-personality beings ourselves. Being like ourselves, our most worldview transactions within a fully complex being like ourselves are most powerfully transacted in stories. This is why stories move us. This is why we watch Netflix and we watch stories. And some people will be watching stories all the time because, in a sense, we're vicariously living different lives, even while we're sitting on the couch noshing on potato chips. In our mind, we're living stories far away, and we've done that through the psychotechnology of books. We've done that through the psychotechnology of storytelling. Maybe I'm not using his word right, but we've done that through movies and through all kinds of ways. We love stories because stories, in a sense, They are a psychotechnology. They change how we feel about time. When you're in a movie theater, time stands still because you're living in this other story, which has its own little time stamp that's going through. So this is very complicated stuff, but we manage it without any difficulty at all. We're highly adapted to it. We are formed by them, moved by them. Story and interpretations are deeply tied. Now, this is a little bit later. This is an axial. It's not that they didn't have stories in the continuous cosmos phase, but in the axial revolution, these stories really take on something big because, for example, to be a Christian is to live within that story. And the more fully you inhabit that story, in many cases, the happier you are. And in fact, it will have impacts physiologically on you. It'll have impacts in your community. And then what we have are communities that are really multiple communities that are stories embedded now being rival. And for example, if you listen to Adam of Think Club, he'll make the argument, he being an atheist, he'll make the argument that the Nazis and the communists would definitely lose because they didn't have as good a story as the West. Now, one of the things I've also noticed is that explanation and story is interesting because part of the demythologizing, the disenchanting of the West happened through stories. And a lot of this is really subtle, but once we have an explanation story, this gave secular materialism a big boost in terms of believability. There's a historical process here. We learn to be sensitive to the implicit action in your consciousness committee. That's advocacy of mind. Learn to be sensitive to the implicit action. And one of the things that I notice, even when John Vervaeke is talking about the axial revolution, I immediately have a little bit of a take back. It's like, oh, wait a minute. Then I think through it, and I've read some Charles Taylor, and I'd heard of the axial, but when Vervaeke's working on it, it's like, ooh, now that you've told an explaining story of the axial revolution, my very axial religious embedding that has been my whole life was suddenly moved. And I felt that. I thought, oh, well, how true is my axial story? Because if you listen to me, I'm a Christian minister, I'll tell you things about life of the age to come, and of course within the big pluralistic element of Christian theology, I'm emphasizing, life of the age to come over we go to heaven when we die. I just opened up a can of worms. That's for other videos, but this gets into why there's Christian resurrection, why the end of the book of Revelation has a new heavens and earth, so on and so forth. John Vervaeke talks about and says that's the psychotechnology of the axial revolution. Part of me is like, ooh, once there's an explaining story, my consciousness committee is working on that. And do I now not believe that story so much? Has, in fact, the materialist, the secular material worldview that, think about it this way. The majority of my consciousness committee is a classical theist. But there's a faction over here, there's a political party that is secular materialist. And when stuff comes about, the majority classical theists will say, yeah, that's classical theism. And the secular materialists will say, yeah, but I get some points in that too. And the pantheists over there say, grasshopper, don't you see? It's all one. And now at this point in my life, the classical theists, pretty strong, stable majority. They've been in power a long time. But the secular materialists, they have their, they're in there too. And it's kind of a good thing they are, because of that little secular materialist party, I can talk to other secular materialists, because here I meet someone and they're a secular materialist, and the secular materialist says, hey, we're all together in Team Paul. Why don't you let us talk to this guy, because we speak their language? And the classical theist says, okay, well, for our own reason, we'll take a step back and we'll let you talk to him. So then you're going to talk to the classical materialist in me. And then I'm walking around and I bump into a friend that I know is someone who sees their life as a spiritual being having a materialist thing. And the little pantheist party says, hey, yeah, let me handle this. I talk their language. I can do that really well. And I know this is bugging some of you, and I'm going to get the comments, and go ahead, let them flow. but that's one way to conceptualize the multiple personalities that are in my mind and the ways that I can engage in all of these different elements. And the same is true of culture, because I grew up with a fair number of African Americans. People will sometimes notice when they watch me talk to different groups, I will take on elements of that group. And if I'm doing it all in English, sometimes people say, well, you were acting this way, and well, maybe it was fake acting or something like that. They don't have any trouble, though, if I switch to Spanish, if I'm speaking with a Spanish speaker. Well, that's the language. Well, there are lots more languages than English, Spanish, German, French, Chinese. There's lots of languages, and they're all subtly built in. And so within our consciousness committee, these different factions function in this way. All right. So, but when there's an explanation, I can feel my secular thing saying, see, there's an explanation. I can explain, so that the secular, team secular, or the secular political party can say, I can explain all of that stuff you theists are pointing to. I can explain that. But then I ask the question, well, what's the motivation behind that? Why do I want to explain the theistic party away? Well, there's some ambition. There's some ego that says, if ambition is probably the better word, if something I can explain is perhaps something I can lay my hands on. Another metaphor. Explanation stories of process and cause, it elicits in me this desiring mastery and duplication. Tends to have a secularizing pull. Team secular, wins some of those debates in consciousness committee. Maybe it's the consciousness congress. Pastor's got to do alliteration. It's the consciousness congress in my mind, okay? And so explanation stories have a pull. So I was thinking about that as I was listening to Vervaeke, because quite rightly so, someone might say, yeah, but you're a Christian and you're listening to Jordan Peterson. Isn't he going to influence you? Yep. You're going to listen to John Vervaeke. Isn't he going to influence you? Buddhism and cognitive science. Be warned. Well, fair enough. And as part of, back to classical theist, team reformed Dutch Calvinist, I would say, yeah, but if I want to engage people in this world, I'm going to have to know how they think. And part of that is going to run the risk of taking on their culture. And if you get to real Christian antitheticalism, say, yeah, but that's evil. But then a little bit of Christian incarnation says, yeah, but Jesus took on the culture of the first century Jews. Now, that can lead to a very interesting conversation. That I don't have time to go there because I want to keep this to an under 3-hour video. But explanations and watching other people, you're opening yourself up to colonization of somebody else's ideas and worldviews. That's part of this game, and that's what we do in this world. All right. And so again, what I notice in me is that explanation stories, the little ambition guy inside of me says, ooh, 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 ooh. If I can explain it, I can master it, and I can reproduce it, and I can do it to others. And that now this little ambition guy, he's not all bad. This little ambition guy is the same guy that said, ooh, study Jordan Peterson, because he's doing things that you clearly don't know how to do. You should learn from him. Oh, that means I'm going to have to read Jung. That means I'm going to have to learn psychology. That means I'm going to have to listen to evolution ideas and Darwin. And so some in the camp are saying, oh, watch out. But the ambition guy is saying, no, you better learn that stuff. You're going to need that stuff. You're going to have to add some more factions in your consciousness congress, okay? Because you're going to need those tools. Explanations are like, well, if there's an explanation, there could be a promise of duplication, could be a promise of mastery, could be a promise of status, Jordan Peterson terms, could be invited to other games, On and on and on and on and on. So then it's like, well, where does this word explanation come from? Now we're getting fun. Late 14th century from Latin. An explanation, interpretation, noun of action of past participle stem, explanare, to make plain or clear. Oh, that's true. Plain, though. Literal, to make level, to flatten. Actually, from the Greek, it's going to come from. But now then it makes me think, what's the difference between flat and where does that word flat comes from? Well, flat, down below, etymology, Middle English flat, borrowing the term from Old Norse, flatter, compared to Norwegian and Swedish flat, Danish flad, Proto-Germanic flates, pleth, flat, akin to the Frisians, flot. There you go. Germans, flows, geographical layer, ancient Greek, platus, plate, plane, flat surface, plane, explanation. We are plano, you plane wood. You begin to look at these words and you begin to see these associations. And what are we doing with an explanation? We are flattening the world. We are making it available to us. And well, Celtic, plain, perhaps also Greek, pelanos, sacred cake, mixture offered to the gods, offering. So these words go in all these ways, and they're deeply built into us through culture over great amounts of time, and an explanation, well, that's going to have an impact in me in ways that my conscious brain is certainly not aware of. And so at play in my consciousness congress is meaning, agency, causality, desire. Ambition is a sort of desire. And we need to stack things up in hierarchies to prioritize because, again, this is Jordan Peterson stuff. Action demands. We live in a forum for action. And in the moment, if I'm going to act in a moment, my brain has to quickly set priorities so I know what to do. And it's not even my conscious. It's not even the conscious control there that is doing that. The consciousness congresses, all the factions are, just like when, okay, I'm going to go into a university. The secular faction or the secular party says, let me do the talking. Because you start using that religious stuff, they're going to kick you out of here. But I go to church, it's like, well, okay, let the religious guy do the talking. Because if you start using all those secular words, they're going to kick you out of here. And, but now I'm preaching and I see some visitors in here. So I'm going to take a look at who they are. I'm going to make some snap judgments based on how they're dressed and where they're sitting, based on their age and race and what kind of car they drove in, if they came in with a visitor. And all of that, my mental congress is going to slightly adapt the sermon. I'm going to pick some words, I'm going to avoid some other words because I'm thinking about how can I colonize, how can I represent, how can I transmit, how can I infect. And so meaning, agency, causality, this stuff is all going, and it's all going at once, and our brains are massively parallel in this way. And we do this stuff without even knowing we're doing it often. But what I want isn't always clear. And what something means isn't clear. And my agency isn't clear. Why did you do that? I don't know. I don't know why I did that. You want me to make up a story to tell you why I did it? I can do that quick. Do I really know why I did it? That's a very different thing. Causality isn't simple. And we're always juggling these things and more. So now back to video 3, the axial revolution as psychotechnology. We can recognize the implicit secularity in the term even, but that shouldn't scare theists because theism has room for secularity. Okay? So historically, we can talk about an axial revolution. That shouldn't scare us, but it's going to impact us. It's going to be there. The axial revolution is the split world, and some of you have been watching my videos for a while know I talk a lot about the split world. This is the way things are down here below, the way things should be up there above, can be, will be. And religion gets particular with this stuff and talks about the process of how things will be what they are and how they will be. In a number of videos, it bumped into comments and discussions about, religion. Well, what is a religion? And one of my at-hand definitions of religion is that it answers certain key questions. And now, as I continue to learn this, I see that, boy, a lot of the questions that I've selected of these key questions, they very much presume an axial perspective. What is good? Well, even the idea of good and the way we use it is deeply embedded in this axial perspective. So pervasive has been the success of this revolution. Well, why? Well, what is this axial revolution? Well, you have the continuous cosmos where, in a sense, I don't have a good idea of the consciousness of my dog, but I sort of believe my dog is living in a continuous cosmos. Does my dog pray? Some of you who are old enough remember the Wittenberg door. I still think it's around. They had an ongoing column about dogs at prayer, and so it rings around. And there's some crusty old historians back there in my Consciousness Congress. Dogs, or was it Dogs Who Love the Lord? I forget what it was. Wittenberg Door's terribly funny spoof, Christian periodical. Wrote good stuff too. Where was I going with this? See, I distract myself. Axial revolution. Yeah. Oh. So the world falls, and you can again listen to Vervaeke. The world falls apart. World is terrible for everyone. How do you cope? Is this a Freudian thing that you project upwards? Maybe. Is it a true thing? Is there really do we really go to heaven when we die? Well, this is an answer that your worldviews are going to impinge on, because you don't have room for it in a secular materialist worldview. And you might say, well, we have this idea of going to heaven when we die, and you might be agnostic or you may be atheistic. We have an idea of going to heaven when we die, and that it encourages us and gives us an adaptive advantage over our neighbors. Okay, that's how you fit that story within a secular frame. Christianity has an idea of progressive revelation, that bit by bit God reveals more to us. Well, the happy hunting grounds, well, they seem to have they definitely had afterlife in the continuous cosmos. If you look at Egypt and call that continuous cosmos, and I know a few of you are going to make comments on that, go right ahead, argue your point in the comments section. But suddenly we split the world, and we have the world that is and the world that should be. And this has religious application. It has application in just about everywhere in life. And over the last number of thousand years, it's become embedded in everything. But then the world continues to change. So the axial revolution was psychotechnology. This affords the possibility of self-transcendence. That not only, and this has continued to change too, not only am I a hunter-gatherer because my father was a hunter-gatherer, now, in a sense, via axial revolution, we have this new psychotechnology that I can change, and I can transcend myself, and I can become other things. And you might even look at the entire gender controversy as being a function of this. Is this late-stage axial revolution, depending on how you see this, or is it axial revolution gone to seed? And, we've tipped too far in the modernist camp, and we've lost touch with biological elements. And so you have the intellectual dark web and that entire debate over the relationships between sex and gender. And can I just say, in my heart, I'm Shirley Temple. And you might see me as something very other than Shirley Temple, but deep inside, I am Shirley Temple. Or deep inside, I am John F. Kennedy. And so I would like his money, and I would like all of the book rights. But women that I didn't treat so well, please call me Paul. So, who am I? What am I? To what degree can I change? To what degree can I self-actualize? To what degree can I remake myself? This is all psychotechnologies afforded in many ways by the Axial Revolution. Gets built into culture, and on and on and on we go. Opens up virtual worlds of the mind, imagination, story that we use to regulate our physiology and our physical world. And the Axial Revolution changes what we are able to do in the world and creates the capacity for building massive multi-person personalities, which is basically nationalism. And all of this stuff is afforded by this new psychotechnology. And here's another fun video that you can watch that someone pointed to me. Robert Sapolsky's Are Humans Just Another Primate? Facet talked about a lot of the same guys that Jordan Peterson talks about and some of that stuff. But on one hand, do we have a lot in common with animals? Sure. But in other ways, we're nothing like them. We go to levels they can't begin to touch. And so, in many ways, the psychotechnologies have afforded this. And this is part of some of what Vervaeke gets into. Just finished up Memories of Alhambra. Had a lot of fun with it. But here's a psychotechnology where you have, well, what if we're living so much in video games? What if, in fact, you can inhabit video games? And I don't want to give away any spoilers, but there are elements of this that cross the line, okay? All of us have this idea of a line. And if you just watch some of if you were to die in a video game, would you be dead? And Esther introduced me to this. She said in her Pathos piece about me, he's a pastor, IRL. And I'm trying to think, what is IRL? And so I said, Esther, what is IRL? In real life. Oh. So if you get killed in real life, IRL, in a video game, does that mean you die? Well, we have long had this question. If you die in your dreams, does that mean you die? Well, that's right on that line, and we wonder where that line is, and we spend more and more time watching stories on Netflix, living within computer games, living within books, living within Christianity, and what to actually have Christianity work as a psychotechnology, you want to be deeply embedded in it, which is why there's a church. Or to be deeply embedded in whatever aspect of your Buddhist practice, you're going to actually have to meditate if you want. Well, I walk by that place with people meditating and it's not happening for me. Well, as a pastor, I do the same kind of telling people, just looking at Christianity and even just going to church and listening to a sermon or listening to a video, that's going to impact you. But the more you give yourself to it, the more impactful it's going to be. This is a psychotechnology to, in a sense, transform our world. And the transformation of the mind, read the Apostle Paul, Romans 12, be renewed. Okay? You are a living sacrifice. That's what Paul says in Romans 12. And be renewed by the renewal of your mind. You put on the new self. You take off the old self. This is all in many ways an Axial Revolution psychotechnology. And it's powerful. All right? And it confirms an experience of meaning. And it's breaking down. Or is it just moving on and moving in? So young Lewis, of course, met Arthur Greaves, and he was kind of told, there's this little kid down the road who's sick, and Lewis, you don't have any friends, you bookish kid, and he doesn't have any friends, so go down. And Lewis is like, I don't want to go visit this stupid kid. Goes down there, and Arthur Greaves is reading something from Norse mythology, and Lewis's eyes light up, and they're like, you like this stuff? Do you like this stuff? Well, here now in community, Norse mythology colonizes them, and it's a psychotechnology, and it begins to grow in them. And this will, in fact, be a lifelong thing of Lewis. While he deconverts from Christianity into atheism, he still maintains his love of mythology. And again, psychologically speaking, it's not hard to imagine why Lewis converted. He loved it. He wanted to inhabit it. He wanted to live within it. And so then he meets guys like J.R.R. Tolkien, and who's also head over heels involved in this, but Tolkien is a serious Roman Catholic, and Lewis then through Tolkien and others begins to desire to inhabit it and becomes a theist, and then becomes a Christian and inhabits it. And he inhabits it, well, he became an Anglican, a mere Christian, if you read Mere Christianity, and he lives within it. And he sees Jesus' resurrection as evidence for Christianity being the true myth. And again, in order for this to be compelling, well, Jesus rising from the dead is a interesting facet of psychotechnology like Memories of Alhambra. That's going to leave you flat. You want to believe it. Well, what if I can't believe it? Well, why can't you believe it? It's because my faction of the secularists is too strong in my head. Well, vote them out. Well, how do I vote them out? Depends on how you live. See, right away. Well, where does the agency come from? Now, I'm right there in the Sam Harris, Brett Weinstein. Where's this agent? But my worldview affords it a little easier than theirs. So, this is what happens to Lewis, and he begins to study the resurrection, and he says, I think this really happened. And then he sees he himself is happier, and he's got more love for people, and he's got one of my arguments is that what Christianity affords, and this is very much along the lines of Peterson, what Christianity affords is a capacity to endure more suffering. Well, why would I want to endure more suffering? Well, because this world is going to dish it out to you, and you can let suffering run you all over the map, or you can be the kind of person that endures it and helps your community through it and makes the world a better place. Petersonian language, you can be the kind of person that when your father dies, you step up and help the rest of the family because, yes, you're mourning inside, and yes, it hurts, but you can keep your stuff together. How? Well, this is a psychotechnology, and one of the ways to do it is a religion and a religious discipline, and it has to do with how you spend all of the time when you're not thinking about your psychotechnology. What do I want from this slide? 150 plus years of explanations from Darwin. I mean, if you read the Metaphysical Club, one of Peterson's recommended books, one of the great interesting things that I took away from that book is, really what Darwin added to the conversation was at that point, Darwin contributed in convincing a lot of people that you didn't need a God to have the processes that led to the world around us. And as Menard, I think that's his name, as Menard says, this is really the turning point and Darwin's big addition. Now, our hierarchies of meaning, agency, causality, desire are always in motion. And the libido dominandi, Augustine's City of God, amazing book. The libido dominandi, it pulls us to mastery. It's Tolkien's ring. But even as our power increases and we find technical ways, psychological and physical, to satisfy desire, meaning slips away. We have flattened the world. And so I'm going to go back to part of, I think this was video 2 or video 3, I don't remember. I'll see it in a minute, of how this happened. So explanations have flattened the world for us, and now suddenly it's having implications that we don't understand.
In a similar way, a lot of these ways of thinking, these psychotechnologies, have become so second nature to us that we forget the historical origin. And that's problematic, because the degree to which we don't have a historical understanding is a degree to which we are going to be ignorant of the historical factors that are driving the meaning crisis. Let me foreshadow that meaning crisis right now. So this is a mere foreshadowing. We're going to come back to it. This is a mythological way of thinking which allows us to articulate and train the psychotechnologies of the axial revolution. These psychotechnologies.
What he showed is a diagram on the board of the everyday world versus the real world, or the true world, or heaven and earth, that differentiation, that the Bible is fundamentally a story about heaven and earth, not heaven and hell.
Of self-transcendence, of wisdom and enhanced meaning. But the problem is, this mythology is failing for us now. The scientific worldview is destroying the possibility of this for us in a way that might seem sort of cosmically ironic. The scientific worldview is returning us to a continuous cosmos. There is no radical difference in kind between you and the primates that you evolved from naturally.
You see no radical difference, or increasingly that's the conclusion that you draw. And because, again, that's the conclusion that is fed to us from our environment.
There isn't some radical difference in kind between your mind and your embodied existence, right? Science is leveling the world.
Flattening. Explanation.
To a one world. We're going to talk about that. But if we can no longer live in this mythology, and that's what mythologies are, they have to be livable. People claim to believe this. Don't tell me what you believe. Tell me what you can practice. Tell me what's livable for you.
You hear Jordan Peterson in that? It's the same point.
For most of us, we can't live this anymore. We still talk this way, but we can't live it. So here's part of the problem. This is a foreshadowing. How do we salvage the ability to cultivate wisdom, self-transcendence, enhance meaning, overcome self-deception, realize who we are and how the world is, when we can no longer use the mythological worldview in which it was born? We are going through a re-embedding. It's been progressive and increasing, right? Copernicus and Galileo re-embed us. Darwin re-embeds us. Einstein re-embeds us. We're being re-embedded back into the physical world, but we don't want to lose all that we gained through the great disembedding. How do we reconcile those? How do we live with the legacy of the Axial Revolution when we can no longer inhabit its worldview? That's part of the problem. That's only part. Now, the place I want to turn...
I was going to go on. Again, watch the whole thing. It's really good stuff. Now, these meta worldviews, again, have their consequences. And I think if you look at, he's exactly right in terms of the flow. So we're moving towards a re-embedding, an explanation. It's plain, it's flat, it's a flattening of the world. And we're seeing this happen, which is why it's interesting that younger people are moving back in Christianity towards sacramentalist versions of Christianity, because it's I need to touch the bread and touch and drink the blood. I need to it needs to be connected, because the two worlds are coming apart. I need them to be closer together, and sacraments is how that happens. One strategy is to double down on the materialism and try to employ the psychotechnologies to mitigate the shortcomings. So again, you've got your three worldview consequences. You've got the secular materialist, you've got the lapsarian, the chaotic lapsarian, that we've lapsed from oneness into chaos, and we long to escape differentiation and return back to oneness. And then you've got the classical theism. And also these meta worldviews are in play also while these other things are moving too. Again, there's lots of stuff moving at the same time. Now, one strategy is to double down on materialism. Say, hey, we left Christianity, we left that behind, and we're moving forward, and what we're discovering is that we can't, not going to go back. So, and this in some ways is analogous to Christians who resisted going into modernity. So now you've got modernists, and modernity is running out, and they're getting nervous. Well, what are we going to do as modernity runs out? You're reading Thomas Nagel, and Thomas Nagel is saying, yeah, it's kind of spent, and we've gone as far as we can, and so We don't know what reintegrating subjectivity is going to mean, and how much of what we've achieved in modernity will be undone by that move. And so this is a very modern secular move. On the surface, people with different meta worldviews or conflicting ones might look similar in this process. Now, you read Kuhn's The History of Scientific Revolutions. Some of these dynamics are at play. And what groups tend to do is, because again, we've got our established consciousness congresses with their warring factions and their competing factions, and we very much want enough stability so that we don't have to cash in status and relationships, because these worldview transitions are very costly in terms of the stability around us. And we usually only make them when we perceive an upgrade available to us. So we usually try to keep the main theory and run adaptation mechanisms to compensate for new information and stories. And you saw this in medieval jiggering of Aristotelian multi-sphere explanation of cosmology to predict planetary motion, and it gives way to a Copernican model that had simpler mathematical formulas to predict the movement of the planets. And you had Newtonian mechanics overthrown by Einstein for very large and very small. And you can see the way these scientific revolutions happen. And you can see the psychology. We'd rather not give up our old system too quickly. We want to adapt and adapt and adapt until our old system becomes unworkable, and then we give it up. And that's essentially how religious conversion works. That's how it works psychologically. That's how it works in terms of communities. That's why whole nations, whole groups of people can flip in within 1 or 2 generations, which is a very short time in religious clock speeds. So worldview problems are vastly more difficult, though, because there's far more data than trying to decide between Aristotle and Copernicus, or trying to decide between Newton and Einstein. In fact, you continue to use Newton in ranges that make sense. And when you get outside of those ranges, then you default to Einstein. But when it comes to worldview problems, there's way, way, way more data. It's far more complex. Plus, we ourselves are in the middle of it. So we've got a world of biases. And unlike, let's say, a Newtonian billiard ball experiment, we can't, you would argue that pragmatism continues to argue persuasively, well, good enough. Well, good enough for what? That's the problem with worldview arguments, because the what is what you're debating. So you cannot possess a monarchical vision. There's a theme that I've had all along. There's no view from nowhere, says Nietzsche. Meaning, causality, desire, and agency are all at play. They're all fluid in this thing. And Vervaeke is right that meaning in the flattening of the world, in this felt worldview, are we going to go back to a continuous cosmos? But then suddenly that flattening, unlike and you can ask a psychological question. Why did the continuous cosmos of the pre-axial age, why didn't they have a meaning crisis there? Well, maybe they did. Maybe that's why they went to axial. Well, okay, axial is under stress, and we're having a meaning crisis there, and it's maybe all these are meaning crises. I don't know. It's a possibility. But these are the ranges that we're working on in these things. These are terribly difficult. You've got the Don Hoffman interface limitations, which is that what we're really dealing with are interfaces, all right? And those interfaces are context specific, they're culturally specific. So there are so many moving parts in these things, and it's amazing that we're sensitive to them at all, but we are. It's terribly difficult to articulate and to map and to really track and follow. Which is why we always use metaphors, because we take very complex things and we feel them intuitively, and we relate them to patterns and systems, and then there are other metaphors that kind of reflect the pattern, so we grab that metaphor and I shoot it out to you through YouTube. We develop tools up to the resolution, but complexity could be infinite in things like this. Even though we are incredibly smart compared to the rest of the world, when we look at the complexity of the world and history And even the limited amount of knowledge that's available to us, even that we can't do. And even us in community we can't crack. And we don't even know when we crack it. It's that hard. So there are long-term worldview negotiations. Christianity under stress by its own success in science. Again, Peterson and Vervaeke will talk about that, and Nietzsche talked about that. Christianity cut its own throat in science and threatens nearly every competing system. One of the things that the complaining about colonialism never factors into is, and you can read Scott Alexander on this in his idea about why Coca-Cola wins. Well, now suddenly we're getting back into natural theology or natural law thinking, because what is happening at a biological level? And so what Vervaeke's working on is cognitive science. So it's an attempt to connect all of this stuff together. But there's this, Scott Alexander talks about universal culture. And colonialism, why, so electricity, I'm watching, so I went through Memories of Alhambra, and my wife and I are kind of watching Korean TV because it's been kind of fun. So now on Netflix, we're watching Mr. Sunshine, which is about kind of the late 19th, early 20th century period in Korea, which was terribly difficult for Korea. And the Japanese were taking over, and the Americans wanted a peace, and the French wanted a peace, and the Germans wanted a peace, and the Russians wanted a peace. Everybody wanted a piece of Korea, and Korea wasn't strong enough to maintain themselves. But electricity comes to Korea, and Japanese fashion comes to Korea, and American ideas come to Korea, and all of those come, and they're all in play. This is what colonialization looks like. This is what colonizing is. And this is always happening in this very dynamic worldview, especially in a highly pluralistic context like we have. Secular materialism, which has been tremendously successful, I would argue in many ways reached its peak and has been in long, slow decline since the First World War. Secular materialism, which just, at least in the West, secular materialism, which displaced it, now seems to be at its end. Again, these things are very slow, so they take generations. You say, well, in my lifetime, yeah, but our lifetimes are like this, and when you have a curve that's like this, you're only going to see a drop like this to this, and in fact, the curves are seldom straight. They're usually bumpy, and they're also contextualized where you're at. So, and of course, there's many contexts in the world. So secular materialism, which displaced it, now seems to be at its end. So how do you compensate? And basically what I think we've seen with a lot of secular Buddhism is that there's a look back into the Axial Age drawer for other tools. And again, I'm really excited to where Vervaeke's going to go with this, because this is a cool story and it's fun to follow. And I love tracking someone who obviously knows more about all kinds of stuff than I know. What I gather from a video is, and what I'm able to kind of chew on and give back to you, is only a small portion of everything that I've learned. So, of course, someone in the comment section say, oh, be careful, Paul. Yeah, I know. But here we are. So you've got the same three meta worldviews completing. So I would argue that the worldviews themselves are working at different clock speeds. Secularism with Buddhist psychotech is popular. Vervaeke, this is what Sam Harris is doing. And I know there's some hardcore new atheists who are really fed up with Sam Harris because he starts talking like a religious person. He does that on Joe Rogan. I hear that, I think, boy, Sam, part of the video I was thinking of making was walking through a whole bunch of the early part of that Joe Rogan talk with Sam Harris and saying, Sam, dude, you're getting more and more religious. You just are. You're thinking like a religious person. You talk like a religious person. You're just religious all over the place, dude. And I know it would offend him. Doesn't listen to me anyway because I'm low status, but here we are. Many others, myself, C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, believe Christianity is still viable. In fact, many Christians resisted the flipping from Christianity to, and again, it's not really flipping. It's another way to represent it might be the number of seats in my consciousness Congress, and then the number of seats in my my church mental congress, and scales up and up and up and up to the Christian Reformed Church, and then churches in North America, and then churches in the Western world, and then churches in the world, so on and so forth. Because part of the beauty of religion is that, in a similar way to Jordan Peterson's Piaget equilibrated state, you've got Christianity going far back in time with a continuous thread of conversation, and you've got Christianity going out horizontally now all over the world in various cultures, and it gives you a common language and reference points in terms of the elements of the religion to allow for productive conversation. And that's one of the real advantages that religious communities have. And still some are trying to work the pantheist, chaotic lapsarian. Now, why is Jordan Peterson effective in the implicit conversion space? Again, this has been the big question that I've been working on in my videos. And one of my conversation partners has been Adam from Think Club. And Adam and Sitch, they do their Sunday video. I just saw the graphic. Gosh. Don't watch YouTube unless you have a sense of humor. Oh boy. So when Adam and I sort of agree and disagree about this, you can go to 306. I'm not gonna play it, but maybe I should play it. It wouldn't take that much to cue it up. Well, apparently it was a super chat that called me out on this, so maybe I'm gonna have to watch the whole thing, or at least look at the original video, because here it came.
Jason M for 5 Canadians says, I'd love to hear Paul van der Klay's take on Danskin.
Come on, Sitch, is van der Klay that hard name to say? I butchered poor Vervaeke's name for a while.
Talk. Danskin sounds like a religious apologist instructing acolytes how to reach the unsaved.
Yeah, very much so.
Do you know who Paul van der Klay is?
Yeah, I did a conversation with him on my Think Club channel. If you want to check it out, you can. Yeah, he is a preacher. I'm forgetting the denomination. I think he's a Calvinist. Yeah. And he does a bunch of Jordan Peterson videos. He's actually a really interesting guy. It's funny because
this is where Adam and I, our disagreement lies. It's an oppositional process that Adam and I are in.
I think he's trying to deconstruct why people are turning to Jordan Peterson and becoming religious, which I think is fascinating. I notice.
Is that happening?
Yeah. He talks to the people. Yeah.
He actually talks to them.
So he's just proving the anti-theist right. We should be anti-Jordan Peterson.
Yeah,
I've said that. I mean, but
Adam is fun because he's an atheist and he's anti-theist, and he just has fun with this. He just trolls Rationality Rules and some of these other guys, and it's just fun to watch.
Get it. I think they get it wrong, because I think actually religion is a pro-social beneficial thing. I really do. But he's an interesting character. The thing that I think he gets wrong, just for those people who are interested, is I notice when I listen to his stuff, when he starts talking in the religious talk, that's very, it's non-materialist. It's non-scientific. It completely, he loses me. I lose interest.
Really? His religion talk is non-scientific. Is this surprising?
But when I listen to Jordan Peterson never does it.
Because Jordan Peterson is fucking proselytizing.
Yeah. Well, I don't think he's proselytizing either. I really don't. I don't think van der Klay is. But I notice, the reason why I think it's interesting, and the only reason why I'm bringing it up is because I do think it's interesting, is that I think the appeal of Jordan Peterson is that he's talking to both sides in a way that they both find emotionally coherent. When he starts talking from a religious perspective, it gives me cognitive dissonance. It's emotionally incoherent for me. But Jordan Peterson has a way of talking where it doesn't give Christians cognitive dissonance, and it doesn't give atheists cognitive dissonance.
Well, some atheists.
And some Christians. It gives some...
Yeah.
And see, I would say it gives because there's lots of different cognitive dissonances, and some cognitive dissonance moves you in one way, and some moves you another way, and again, it's all very dynamic.
Because
I guess if we parse out atheists from anti-theists.
I don't, the people who are going after him, though, I don't know if they've ever even listened to Jordan Peterson, to be honest with you. Because they're just straw manning him to death.
What do you mean? Hugo and Jake are reading his book. What are you talking about?
His entire book, but they're reading it through these crazy Jordan Peterson is a misogynist lenses.
He's a transphobe. So, didn't one of them come out as trans?
Really? Oh my God, we have to do another stream.
I think so. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Oh my God. No, he got like blue hair or something. He didn't come out as trans.
There's blue hair is the gateway drug to trans, I guess. So, but that's I love Adam and Sitch's. I love Adam and Sitch's dialogues. They're really fun and funny. And so Adam actually and I have kind of a agree-disagree here, because I think Adam's exactly right, and I think in terms of your meta worldview, you're going to open and close people's ears depending on your meta worldview, and that's why you have the tells, and that's why the tells work in terms of status with the people that you're talking about. If you're in a university and you say, well, the Greeks believed in going to the oracle, and when the oracle would speak, they would take a psychedelic and a demon would talk through the oracle. Boom. It's just lost a whole bunch of people. They're not going to listen to anything you have to say anymore. Others are going to listen to what John Vervaeke just said, and, well, here's the thing. They know that in the university context, the Christian status, at least in a secular university, in a Christian university, it's going to be different, but the status equations are going to be different. So if you're a Christian in a secular university, you listen to John Vervaeke say that and say, then maybe you try and adapt it. And a lot of what I do is a lot of this adaptation stuff. And so I can understand it through a Christian filter. I can understand it through these other filters. And here they're complaining about this guy that they're reading Jordan Peterson through this hit job filter that was done on Peterson, and so on and so forth. So we're all seeing it through these filters, and I love Stitches. So you're surprised, the religious language, of course, and this is where, why is Jordan Peterson effective in the implicit conversion space? Of what is Jordan Peterson doing? And I think it has everything to do with the line, and so Adam and I agree that it has to do with the line, but Peterson is, oh boy, I might have a talk with an Australian author who has gone Owen Benjamin in a sense, in terms of Christians who have in a sense turned on Peterson, and a number of those people were saying things like Peterson is a closet Christian and he's just walking the line so that others will hear him. And now I'm a Christian minister. I can't walk that line because there's nothing closet about a minister, hopefully. Oh, gosh, that goes all kinds of different places. But my consciousness Congress is much more like British Parliament. They yell at each other, and then I listen to them yell and I laugh. So they're not like the American Congress. A little bit of discipline. All right. Where was I? So there's this line, okay? And so when I start talking religious stuff, I lose Adam because it's not his worldview. He doesn't have respect for that worldview. He, in fact, I don't know his life, he might lose status if he adopted that worldview. If you're in a secular university, you lose status if you adopt that worldview. If you're in a Christian college or a Christian university and you don't have the worldview that's implicit in the principalities and powers of that institution, you lose status by the other worldview. So again, this all has, Adam basically is deep into Jonathan Haidt and sociology of knowledge, a bunch of these things. That's really where Adam's interest lies. And so all of these things are parsed out in this way. And so then the question is, again, the question that drove me to YouTube and started me making videos and launched me on this road that I've been for a year is, why is Jordan Peterson so effective at this? And there are many, it's a multi-factor thing. Does Jordan Peterson even want to be effective at this? I'm sure he likes being popular. His main motivation that I see is helping individuals experience their life better. I don't see him as being necessarily interested in getting a lot of people to go to church, since the man himself doesn't go to church, okay? But now, all of these things are in play. Bias, formation, pride, status. I've been reading Michael Pollan's book. And again, I'm always looking for these worldview tells. One part of Pollan's mind he doesn't want to change. And same with Adam. Is Paul trying to proselytize? Yes. But also, if you don't become a Christian, I will still be your friend. And that is the truth. One part of Pollan's mind is he doesn't want to change. Is his worldview, and that comes through very quickly. Now, this is a book I've really enjoyed. I have learned a ton from this book. I knew nothing about psychedelics, and this book has changed my mind in a lot of different ways. But is the book and the subject really simply about coming to comfortable terms with the spiritual? And I think when we get into this meaning crisis, and as a pastor, my particular view of watching people navigate these spaces from the perspective of a pastor, because people have different conversations with me as a pastor, and they'll avoid different conversations. And part of the reason a lot of pastors, especially Protestant pastors, don't dress investments or identify themselves 24/7 in a religious way is because we're sneaking. We can sneak in, and people will say all kinds of things, and then they'll say, we'll be having a conversation, we'll go, and they'll cuss, and they'll just do things like normal people, and then they'll say, well, what do you do for a living? Well, I'm a pastor. Did I cuss in front of you? Yeah, you did. And again, depending on if, I remember I had a situation where I was opening the church for a poll, and someone came in and was doing stuff, and there was an African-American young man, and again, my community's heavily African-American, as is my church, and then I was opening doors, and we were just talking, having a nice conversation, and then, well, what's your relationship to this church? Well, I'm the pastor. It's like, oh, I've been calling you by your first name. Yeah, you can call me by my first name, but African-American culture is a little different from white culture in terms of these things. So I would never call a pastor by their first name. I wasn't raised that way. Oh. These are cultures. These are status. These are biases. This is formation. This is hierarchy. And what white culture is really over, in some ways tortured by, and this comes through in Pollan's book, is this word spiritual. So here this is at the end of his chapter where he's tried all these different psychedelics and is reflecting on his experiences. Yet I wonder if my dissatisfaction with the survey, this was a survey as to whether or not he had a mystical experience, had something to do with the intrinsic nature, the sheer intensity and bizarre shape of the toad experience, for which it wasn't designed after all. Because when I used the same survey to evaluate my psilocybin journey, the fit seemed much better and rating the phenomenon much easier. Reflecting just on the cello interlude, for example, I could easily confirm the fusion of my personal self into a larger whole, as well as the feeling I had experienced something profoundly sacred and holy, and of being a spiritual height. Now remember, when Jordan Peterson's having his debate with Sam Harris, I'm not reading, Sam Harris said, well, I've done psychedelics, and Jordan Peterson says, do more. You'll get religious. It'll tip your worldview. Well, this is exactly what Pollan, I don't know how to say his name either, is wrestling with. And even the experience of unity with ultimate reality. Yes, 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 and yes, provided that my endorsement of these loaded adjectives doesn't imply any belief in a supernatural reality. Boom. Read Jonathan Haidt and disgust. There's implicit disgust in there. I don't want to be like those crazy religious people. This is status, community, hierarchy, bias. It's all at play, and it's right there in the worldview matrix. Another quote. Part of the problem I was having evaluating my experience had to do with another big and loaded word, mystical. implying as it does an experience beyond the reach of ordinary comprehension or science. It reeks of the supernatural. It doesn't have a nice fragrance of the supernatural. It reeks of it. And this guy is a really skillful author. He is a really good writer, and I'm loving this book. But right there's a worldview tell. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's his worldview. And you don't have to be offended by it. It just is. And that's how he sees the world. And you can still be his friend if you're a Christian. Yet I think it would be wrong to discard the mystical. I was trying to come to terms with it. If only because so much work has been done by so many great minds over literally thousands of years to find the words for this extraordinary human experience and to make sense of it. When we read the testimony of these minds, we find a striking commonality in their descriptions, even if we civilians can't quite understand what in the world or out of it they're talking about. And see, I think this is the meaning crisis implicit here in this conversation, because I think it will probably tend to be a lot of white secular materialists who are feeling the achy void. And maybe if they have a psychedelic, it will help them answer the spiritual problem. Now, I know others who are working on psychedelics in order to work on addictions. Another quote: "My own interpretation of what I experienced, my now officially verified mystical experience, remains a work still in progress, still in search of the right words, but I have no problem using the word spiritual." Okay, what does that word mean within a materialist worldview? That's the question. That's why spiritual gets fudgy for our culture. I have no problem using the word spiritual to describe elements of what I saw and felt, as long as it is not taken in a supernatural sense. There's his disclaimer. There's his tell. For me, spiritual is a good name. Why? Is a good name for some of the powerful mental phenomena that arise when the voice of ego is muted or silenced. If nothing else, these journeys, so in other words, he's going to have difficulty integrating spiritual and ego. So if he goes to one of David Fuller and Ali's men's retreats, well, they're going to work on him with that. If nothing else, these journeys have shown me how that psychic construct, at once so familiar and on reflection so strange, stands between us and some striking new dimensions of experience, whether of the world outside or the mind within. The journeys have shown me what the Buddhists tried to tell us, but I have never really understood, that there is much more consciousness than ego, as we would see if we would just shut up, and that is dissolution or transcendence is nothing to fear. In fact, it is a prerequisite for having any spiritual progress. Another big word. I'll do a slide before this one, so hang on. Here's a video that someone recommended to me. All of 43 views right now. He took it down, he put it up again. Fascinating video of this young man who grew up very Roman Catholic, gave it all away, has a rather unusual something. I don't know exactly what to call it. A psychologist would have the right name for it. I won't offer one. But doing, oh no, I can't remember his name. This is what happens when I move off the reservation. I can find it in the description probably. Gabor Mate, a week to try to work on his issues with psychedelics. And again, if you watch a video like this, you find that people with a secular materialist worldview, well, all of your worldviews are going to make certain things more complicated and certain things easier. They're going to afford some things, and they're going to not afford other things. And this is all in play. Back to this slide. Yes. So you got Jordan Peterson and the line. And I think Adam is right. Jordan Peterson, because of his relationship with the line, this is really vital in what Peterson is doing. Sam Harris worked really hard in the conversations with Jordan Peterson to apply status, social pressure to get Jordan Peterson say that the physical of resurrection of Jesus most certainly did not happen. Sam was really determined to get Jordan to say that. And watch the clip, watch the body language. Fascinating interchange. But outside of that pressure, Peterson reverts back to normal Peterson on this stuff. Peterson works the prayer angle, and that's when he put Harris in a bind. The prayer angle in a way to not have him accept the line. Is this Hegelian subsumption? Can the line be subsumed? This is the question of the last 100 years, and I think this is a big part of Peterson, why people are first they're religion flipping, and then some of them are worldview flipping. Because here's the thing, you can if you just dabble in religion, this is where the belief conversation gets really interesting. Because if technically Peterson is right with his pragmatic understanding of belief, but as the point I made in my Sunday school class last Sunday, you look in Greek at belief in the New Testament, it's one word we translated into two. One is belief and the other is trust. And so for most instances of believe in the New Testament, you can flip that on trust. And now there's another long conversation in that. If you want to look at my Sunday school lesson, just go to my church channel. It was it's the debate on the word spiritual. Maybe I'll put the link down below. But here's the thing. The question is trust, because trust gets much more at action than belief, because we in the axial age have transcended ourselves to have these beliefs, which in a way we've also divorced in ourselves from how we behave. And Vervaeke was talking about that, and Peterson is talking about that, and why Peterson, I think, has had the impact he's had is because, unlike Vervaeke, Peterson is not willing to agree to the line. And maybe Sam Harris will bully him into it at the end of one of the talks, but then Peterson will, again, revert to the mean, as Sam Harris will. And Brett Weinstein says, I'm not going to let you guys revert to the mean. They both did. Because that's where he's at. And again, under pressure, we'll start using different words and start moving over here. But once that pressure's off and we go back to our other environment, we will resume who we have been and what we have believed and the kinds of things that we're working on in our Consciousness Congress. And all of that will be in play. And the reason Peterson is so cagey and doing this is obviously not only because he's on the line, because he blurs the line. Lots of other people try to blur the line, but because Peterson brings everything else he does to it, and because he deals so much in the Bible, and because that line is blurry in just the right way. And I haven't even figured all of that. My resolution has gotten higher and higher and higher, but why do I want to know that? Now, I'm not going to be able to do what Peterson does because I see the lines. And what I've done through this whole video is talk about the lines. And I'm not straddling a fence like Peterson is in a way. And so people's response to me will be different, just as Sitch's was. But this is part of what's happening, and it's part of this migration. And so all of this stuff, Vervaeke's videos, Peterson's videos, it's all terribly interesting to me because, well, part of it is obviously my professional interest in terms of what I do as a pastor. Part of it is inside myself, because I have a Consciousness Congress and I have my factions and they're always debating. And so what happens is I grab this information. Well, the secularist materialist faction in my Congress says, yeah, keep watching those Vervaeke videos. They're giving us stuff to use those against those dirty theists. And the theists are like, well, keep watching those videos, but be a little careful because we don't want you flipping the Congress by a Vervaeke. The last thing we need is another Christian minister coming out and saying, oh, by the way, I never really believed in God. that doesn't play well for the classical theist faction, and I guess the pantheists are like, oh, come on, why don't you two just stop already? It's all good. It's all one. Don't worry about it. Hey, and read more of those psychedelic books. I'm kind of interested in those stories. So it's all at play, and Peterson winds up coming in there, and that's why I talk to people. I want to say, how did Jordan Peterson mess with your head? I want to know. Oh, it's my last slide. So we're under 3 hours. That's a good thing. I do that all by myself, and Adam can say, yeah, you spent 3 hours making one video. Why won't you come on my live stream? And maybe I'll have to do that with him. It's just Sunday afternoons aren't the best time of day for me. I have a job I do on Sunday mornings and often afternoons. So anyway, so thanks for watching. I hope it was helpful. I have no idea what I'm going to entitle this, but I had fun.